So you're saying you were the biggest challenge in this project?
Yeah. My size, Don said, I kind of
That's
fell
what
in
I'm
love
hearing.
with. I fell in love with what we had already
Jonathan's
done.
ego was the biggest challenge in the project.
Right, yeah, it all.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Academy of Management Review's Origin Series. My name is Rich McAdock, and I am an associate editor for AMR, and I'm your host for this show. Today, I will be interviewing two of the co-authors of a paper called The Social Nature of Stakeholder Utility. Don Lange and John Bundy are here to talk about the paper, which they co-authored with Eunyoung Park. So, gentlemen, welcome to the AMR Origin Series.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Rich. Glad to be
my
here.
Pleasure, absolutely. So why don't you just start us off by giving us a brief kind of elevator pitch description of the paper and what it does in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, sure. I'll take that. I think what we were trying to do with this paper, and hopefully we did achieve, was in thinking about stakeholder relationships and how firms manage their stakeholder relationships, we wanted to get beyond the dyadic view. There's a lot of really great and interesting research that looks at how the firm and the stakeholder interact as kind of individual entities, and how we can maximize utility for stakeholders and we can maximize return for the firms, but we've only kind of just begun considering kind of what happens outside of that dyad. We get out of the relationship and kind of deeper into the social system. And I think there's some great research happening right now on that system, and that's where we wanted to contribute. So as the title kind of highlights, the social nature of stakeholder utility, we wanted to get at kind of the socio-political interactions that happen between the stakeholder, between the firm, and between kind of the other stakeholders in the world around it. And so what we outlined here is a framework for kind of understanding how stakeholders will use that social environment to assess their utility. And we highlight three different factors that kind of go into that utility judgment. One is how the firm's treatment of other stakeholders is consistent with their worldview. Another draws on equity theory and considers interpersonal equity and inequity judgments. And then the third framework, the third view, draws on kind of more neoclassical economic theories of instrumental gain and loss. Again, all relative to how the stakeholders' view of other stakeholders' treatment influences their own utility judgment. So really trying to get at this kind of systematic perspective of that stakeholder utility judgment, kind of take us beyond just that dyadic relationship. And now the final thing I'll add here, just so we can have a conversation, would be we also wanted to recognize that it's not all roses. A lot of the research that we find on stakeholder theory that does consider the social environment kind of looks at it in a very positive way, that by treating one stakeholder well, other stakeholders will view that and that they'll be happy and that their utility will increase as well. And so we certainly acknowledge that and appreciate that and quite frankly want more of that. But we also wanted to recognize that there are times when one stakeholder might view the treatment of another stakeholder negatively and might decrease their utility when others are treated more positively. So we wanted to get kind of that dynamic and that relationship into kind of a more systematic theory that we could present. So that's probably the elevator pitch.
Yeah, I like the clever approach of taking a systemic perspective on the topic. It's kind of what, if I put my economist hat on, kind of what an economist would refer to as a general equilibrium approach in some sense. Okay, so tell us a little bit about, since this is the AMR Origin series, we are interested in the origins of of the papers that are published in AMR for the purpose of demystifying the theory creation process for potential authors. So tell us a little bit about the origins of this project. Where did it come from?
Well, one, I guess, general rule I have for sort of coming up with ideas and projects is thinking about what's been bothering me lately. Like, what are the, I actually think that a really terrible way of idea finding is just sit in front of your blank computer screen with the cursor blinking at you and trying to come up with an idea. But it's better to sort of think about what it is that you just kind of in the back of your mind, it's nagging at you. And so I really started getting this this nagging feeling. I should say, first of all, that I was getting pretty deep into the stakeholder literature and hanging around with all the big names in stakeholder theory, you know, Freeman and Harrison and Phillips and Wicks and those and Sybil Sachs and Jay Barney and all the people who are kind of making this a really interesting area of study. And so one of the things that started of great interest to me, and great interest to stakeholder theorists, is sort of why does a stakeholder stick with a firm? And that's a super important problem for firms, because they need the stakeholders who provide the resources for the firm to continue thriving and for it and surviving. And so people like Bossy and Harrison have been really interested in how there's this synergy that goes on, that you kind of can get more interested engagement by stakeholders if you treat your stakeholders well. If you treat your employees well, maybe your customers are going to like your place better. And that idea, that sort of positive ripple effect idea, was going on and is still going on in the stakeholder literature. And it's an important idea. We like that idea. But at the same time, I don't know, I had this paper in mind, from this really nice paper that you guys are probably familiar with, but Nickerson and Zanger and SMJ in 2008, where they talk about, it's not a stakeholder paper, but it could be, because they're talking about envy within organizations and comparison costs for the organization, and how this psychological phenomenon of envy actually has an effect on the structure of firms. And I love that paper, and I love the idea, and so here's what's nagging in the back of my mind. If we got these strong effects that actually affect the way firms are structured, sort of what's inside the firm and what outside the firm, you have to read that paper to understand what I'm talking about. But then why are we always assuming that there's positive ripple effects when you treat one set of stakeholders well with other stakeholders? Why wouldn't things like envy kick in? And so around 2016, the Carrier Corporation, the big company in Indiana that makes heating equipment or refrigerating equipment, decided they were going to move a factory to Mexico. It seemed like a normal business decision to satisfy the stakeholders, get lower production costs. And in late 2016, it becomes a major issue when it becomes part of presidential candidate Donald Trump's campaign. And now there's picketing and a huge backlash politically and across across the U.S. To this sort of business decision. And so this kind of reaction to how other stakeholders are being treated. In other words, shareholders are being looked out for, but other stakeholders are really mad. And so that kind of thing is interesting to me. Then there's this opportunity in 2017 where Sybil Sachs and Sharon Alvarez are putting together a session at the conference with people like Harrison and Barney and Mitchell and others on uncertainty in stakeholder theory. And I got invited to do a talk, and so this thing that's been nagging at me, uncertainty in stakeholder relations, I thought, well, this is a considerable amount of uncertainty. It's like this social effect. How are you going to be happy with how? Is stakeholder B going to be happy with how you're treating stakeholder A? Or are they going to be mad? And will that affect their satisfaction? So I did that presentation, and then I got back from the academy and I grabbed John Bundy, because I knew Like he's been really thinking about the stakeholder literature and he's very interested in this idea too. And then we had a brand new doctoral student, Eunyoung Park. And so the team formed almost like a week after the academy. And anyway, that's the origin story. It's just this kind of nagging issue. It's like, why is it that we kind of assume positive ripple effects? Maybe there's a negative ripple effect we should be fleshing out.
I'll jump in and say I attended that presentation. I had no idea what Don was going to present on. It was obviously just the topic was interesting to me around stakeholder uncertainty, and in classic AOM fashion, they severely undercounted the popularity of Jay Barney and a few others who were, and maybe Don himself, who were speaking. So I remember the room being like tight packed, like hundreds of people into this teeny tiny room, and it was really, really hot. And we were all in there for like an hour and a half while these great presenters were sharing the ideas. And then as Don noted, he came up to me right after we got back from Academy here at Arizona State and said, "We got to work on this paper." And I said, "Yeah, I thought you already had a paper, but great. It sounds like a good idea." And so we kind of got rolling then with Young and as a team. So it was a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
I like that story because it highlights how how generative it can be to just simply notice inherent contradictions in the literature, or at least tensions, put it that way.
Let me add one thing, Rich, to what you just said, because I think, and I always give this advice to doctoral students, you got to really read the literature and in order to notice these things that people are. And honestly, we're not contradicting this stakeholder literature at all. We are really adding to it. It feels really good because it feels like we're just taking the next step. So we're not challenging much in the literature, except that, hey, here's another direction you guys haven't looked at yet. So, but knowing the literature very well, and then being able to look at these events happening in the real world, like, well, envy. We can see envy in our own departments. I mean, envy is all around us, and then looking at things like these big political. Another example that we love is how investors seem to be mad at Costco because they're treating employees better than Walmart does. I mean, that kind of thing is really interesting to us. It's like, why? It seems like the investors are most satisfied when the employees are getting the least value, and even though it could be, and some analysis has shown that Costco gets benefits from treating their employees better because
Right.
they have more retention and they're able to attract better, I'm going to say more seasoned people and so forth. So anyway.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that raises the question, can stakeholders be too demanding for their own good in some sense? So that's just, I like that. I like that origin story about how, just simply noticing that the two pieces of literature have opposite implications can lead to a clever contribution. So, okay, so why don't I ask you to walk us through some aspects of the paper in a little bit more detail, and for that purpose, I will share my screen. So this is the main table from the paper, Table 1. Can you talk us through what's in this table and what does it mean in terms of your contribution?
One thing that we noticed in the literature was that there'd really been quite a bit of thought about equity. I mean, that's equity theory is pretty old, pretty established theory. It's sort of that people are using others as their reference for comparison. And so we thought that had to be part of this story. And it certainly was part of the Nickerson and Zanger story about envy. It's like if you see somebody else getting paid more than you, that starts to get really pretty irritating pretty fast. And but we thought there's got to be more. So anyway, that's one of the roles we definitely see stakeholders as fulfilling. And so the question is, how does the other stakeholders reflect on my own treatment? And we thought it could. And I guess an example we really like in this is just the example of people flying first class.
Mm.
and looking at the other class, like looking at the coach class, or people flying coach and looking up at first class, and sort of how are people using the treatment of the other stakeholder to evaluate their own treatment. So that's our starting point. John?
Yeah, I would say, based on kind of Don's reading, as he said, in Envy and some others, and of course the stakeholder literature for a long time has recognized the importance of kind of equity and fairness. Some of Flora Boudreau's work and Harrison and them, and so we use that as a starting point. But we wanted to think about what else, and in a lot of my own research, I've considered two different dimensions in terms of stakeholder relationships. One of these is what I call the values dimension, right? How do the values of the organization and the stakeholder kind of mesh and get along with each other? And then, of course, the other is the more classic instrumental dimension. What are they getting out of that relationship? So we wanted to kind of also think about how those two dimensions also fit into the equation. One of the fun things too is Don and I both teach ethics here at ASU in the various MBA programs. And we had just, around this time, it was 2017-ish, if I've got my timeline correct. Around this time, we were both really integrating moral foundations theory quite a bit into our classes, which is essentially Jonathan Haidt's idea that we all have these different value structures and foundations as individuals. There's a lot of overlap between us, but those things kind of input into our worldview and determine how we get along with each other, how we like each other, right? And so we kind of started thinking about that and saying, well, obviously this worldview dynamic is also important, not only to our interpersonal relationships, my relationship with Don or with Rich or with Young, but also as stakeholders, our relationships with organizations. We like organizations that have worldviews that are consistent with our own, and we maybe dislike organizations that have different kinds of worldviews. And so we thought about, well, that's not just it's not just in that dyadic relationship, it's also kind of in the systems relationship. If I see an organization treating another stakeholder in a way that's consistent with my values, that's probably likely to make me happy or to increase my utility. And if I see an organization kind of mistreating another stakeholder in a way that's inconsistent with my values or my worldview, that's going to make me dislike and maybe reduce my utility. And what we think is really important about this social worldview is that's kind of all in absence of any of the instrumental benefits, of any of the actual outcomes associated with the relationship. I just might reduce my utility based on that worldview alone. And one of the examples
that's why we call it a principle-based rather than outcome-based judgment worldview, because we're just interested in one of the examples that I'm not sure we use in the book or in the paper or not, but we definitely use it in presentations, and that's the what's the matter with Kansas book, where one of the premises of the book is that people sometimes vote against their own economic interests out of strong ideology. And that's something that John and Young and I were very interested in, is the idea that people could, it would have this worldview actually influences the other two, like how you assess equity and inequity and how you assess instrumental gains, that it actually colors the other two as well as just giving you information about when you look at how the other stakeholders being treated, you get information about the company's principles and about the company's ideology.
Right.
One of the examples we used was this giant corporate tax cut in 2018, and speculating how people with different ideologies, different points of view would be happy or sad about the way that a corporation used their tax cuts, for example, either to give it back to shareholders or to give bonuses to employees or whatever they chose to do. But it's what they choose to do signals part of what their principles are, part of what their ideology is.
And we felt like that just hadn't quite been captured in the stakeholder literature yet, right? That we know a lot about how, if my instrumental value goes up, I'm happier in the relationship, I want to stick around. But what we never really quite considered was, is there a chance that maybe my actual instrumental outcomes go down, yet my utility in the relationship goes up because the firm is doing something that I like. So the example we use in the paper is, if McDonald's or Burger King or whatever fast food company raises wages for employees, maybe like me as a customer, I'm okay with actually paying more for my hamburger or whatever it might be, because I know that employees are getting a better wage, right? So even though like my instrumental benefits actually go down, I have to pay more for the goods and services, maybe my utility actually goes up because it displays that worldview consistency, right? And so we wanted to capture that with this principle-based judgment, in addition to the two outcome-based, the one that's relative, which is the equity stuff, which is really well established, and we were kind of just integrating that well-established stuff into our theory here. And then like I said, the classic economic arguments about gains and losses.
Let me hit on that one for just a second. So that last one isn't quite as straightforward as it seems. The one about instrumental gains and losses, it's how might the other stakeholders' treatment lead to my own gains and losses? And so this is not like psychological equity and inequity comparison. This is one example that I like to think about is if you have this high-powered person who gets hired in your department, your academic department, and they are all of a sudden getting a giant salary. You could look at that two different ways. You could look at it as taking away from the total pie that allows you for the possibility of getting more of a cut of that pie later on. In other words, it could take away from your ability to have an income increase in the future. So that would be like a zero-sum way of looking at this situation. And a pie expanding way of looking at it was, this person's going to bring in so much attention and maybe resources to our department that they are actually going to be good for me. So it's a very much a individual evaluating this as either a pie expanding or zero-sum situation.
Well, and there's a third possibility too, which is that, I recognize as a result of this, that this is an organization that rewards excellence and performance. And that gives me opportunities that if I'm willing to make whatever sacrifices are needed to achieve that level of excellence, then I too can get those rewards.
Absolutely. So.
Yeah, and this was just the fun thing about writing this paper was recognizing those social interpretations, right? The idea that this isn't just a me and the firm as a stakeholder and firm kind of interpretive relationship. It's also about, how does the firm treat everyone else? How do I interpret that from various perspectives, and kind of make my ultimate utility assessment? And Rich, one of the fun things about working on this paper through the process, so kind of outside of the ideas, but the process was, we had 3 co-authors, and we have these 3 kind of dimensions that we're assessing utility on. So it was really fun. The way we kind of organized the work was, each of us took one of them. I took the worldview, Don took equity, and Young took the instrumental stuff. And we kind of did this like independent writing exercise. And then we came together and just critiqued everybody's writing and made a bunch of changes to each other's. And so it was just a lot of fun, because we kind of just did this divide and conquer, but then come back together. And it was a different way of working on a paper that I've experienced, and ended up being, I learned so much in the process, because I got to see kind of Don's independent writing and Young's independent writing, and they got to see mine. And then we got to work on integrating those things. So it was just kind of a cool process to do.
Yeah, that's convenient that there, you had 3 co-authors and 3 perspectives that you were pursuing, right. So you could nominate one to be the champion of each perspective. Exactly. And that frees you, I would think, to, be able to pursue, that particular perspective for at least a while, for at least a part of the writing process, without thinking about how is this necessarily going to connect up with the whole, and then worrying about drawing the connections later.
Yeah. And it was, as you two well know, with AMR, sometimes it's easy to get overwhelmed with all the stuff that you're trying to do and combine and bring together. And we were drawing from 3, 4 different theories and trying to make sense of all of them. And so that was what was really fun, as you noted, Rich, was we were able to each kind of do a deep dive into our separate ideas, but then we always had to keep the overarching, how do these things speak to each other and integrate at the top of our minds. And then of course, when we came back together as the three of us, that's where a lot of that really great integration work came out.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So who is the target audience for this paper? Who should read it?
Well, I guess there's a couple target audiences, and I think one is all of our friends in stakeholder theory who are doing such interesting work, and honestly, we think it's a really, John and I both, and Young, we all think it's a really important area of exploration. So we want. And we've had a lot of positive feedback so far, actually, from those people. We want it to be a contribution that it continues to inspire others, and that people in that line of thinking will continue to build on. John?
Yeah, definitely the stakeholder theory folks. And what I love about kind of the current conversations in strategy, kind of more writ large. Is that kind of stakeholders are getting a lot more attention recently. Of course, we had the Business Roundtable do their big declaration a couple of years ago on the redefining the purpose of the firm, and folks like Jay Barney and Anita McGahan and others are kind of getting into stakeholders and stakeholder theory a lot more. And so in addition to kind of centrally focused on the stakeholder theory folks, I would say anyone trying to manage relationships in organizations, so strategy, even OB folks, might get something out of this paper, because ultimately that's what the paper is about. It's how does the firm manage its relationships with stakeholders, because the paper is about how stakeholders understand and interpret those relationships, and of course that influences their behavior after they do that interpretive work. And so our hope is that a lot of folks will be attracted to some of the core ideas here, because I think they're wide in scope in terms of and that comes from, we drew quite widely on different theories as we were crafting the paper and the ideas. And so our hope is that a lot of folks,
I mean, this is an example we give later on in the discussion section, but managers today are under a lot of pressure to get involved in social issues, and this should be a vexing problem for top managers as to whether or not an organization should take a stance on an area that's controversial, kind of irrespective of their personal feelings. And one thing I guess one complication we just want to add to thinking about that is that you should be thinking about the worldviews of the people that you're trying to keep on board. And it could be that it will be a way of satisfying those people, and it could be a way of doing the opposite. So it's just we don't think this paper provides any easy answers for managers, but we do think it helps provide some more nuances that they should be thinking about while they're making that kind of decision.
Ultimately, it's not just about what you deliver, the phone or the desk or the food or whatever it might be that you're selling to folks, right? And of course, we've known this for a long time, but we're trying to kind of connect some of those dots from the great research. As Don kind of noted at the intro, we really like this paper because we don't think we're challenging anybody. We're just taking that next step, doing a lot of some of the integrative work that we think is needed. So, the folks that are studying non-market strategy and corporate political activism and engagement, right? These are like really important questions that I don't think firms and managers have any answers to right now. And so the hope would be we can give them at least some ways of thinking about it, a framework for kind of understanding how stakeholders kind of ultimately decide whether they're happy or not with your organization.
Right. Okay. Well, let me shift gears then. So for the benefit of maybe less experienced researchers who may be watching this video, I always like to say, having a great idea is it's kind of an essential starting point, but it's not enough by itself, right? So you had this great idea based on this insight of the conflict between the envy literature and the positive ripple effect literature and stakeholders. So that's a great insight, but that's not a paper in itself, right? So you have to, and you got to the point where you could express some basics of this idea in your presentation at the conference, right?
Mhm. Yep.
So tell us a little bit about, the process that you went through to coalesce this and solidify it into an actual manuscript from the point where you give that presentation at the conference to the point where you have an initial draft of the manuscript to submit to a journal. Take us through that journey with you.
So I'll start, and then I know John's going to jump in, but I think so I believe looking back on my notes at that presentation I did at the Academy, it was really pretty equity focused. And I was really thinking about the Nickerson and Zanger paper about envy. And then I just have the wonderful opportunity to work with John and Young and to sit and brainstorm with them. Like it's just talk about what is it that you look at in another stakeholder, and of course we can just bring this down to the level of the person in the next office, or you can think about it at any level of analysis, sort of stakeholder groups, or whether it's just that next person next door who's like getting a different pay level than you are. And so it's thinking about all the things that go into that, and then and that starts to flesh out these three lenses that were not part of my original thinking, and that I wouldn't have come to, at least not readily, without the help of those other two. And so, John, where do we go from there?
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was honestly one of the funnest things that we did in the process, because Don gives this presentation at Academy. I had no knowledge of it beforehand. I listen and watch it, and then we connect when we get back. We're like, this is a really good idea. And Don's presentation was mostly examples. So he was just kind of looking at the world really phenomenologically and kind of saying, here's what I see and what's some of the uncertainty that surrounds it. And then Young was first semester doc student. And we say, you want to work on this paper with us? She says, sure. We're like, okay, you're in our weekly meetings. And so we had a weekly brainstorming meeting probably for the first 6 months, right? I don't think we wrote a word for that whole semester. We would just meet. We would get Don's whiteboard. We always did it in his office, and we would just draw pictures and ideas and get things down. Don and I are not shy people, and so we would have disagreements, and those were a lot of fun. They were like that positive kind of disagreement where we say, no, we want to go this way or that way. And poor Young in her first semester ever was just kind of watching me and Don on occasion yell at each other in very friendly ways, of course. And so it was, I think, a great learning experience for her. I hope she would say, maybe she would say that.
She got early exposure to the inner workings of the sausage factory.
That's right. And the great thing about Young, just to put a plug out here, she's on the market, people, was she jumped in right away too, right? I think, maybe the first couple of meetings she saw us get really excited, and that kind of bled into her, and she's just brilliant in her own regard. And so she really contributed from day one, like I said. And so it was just a lot of fun just kicking it around, and maybe folks who have never written a theory paper before think, oh, it's easier. You just have to sit and write, and there's no data to deal with and things like that, right? We kicked the idea around for 6 months for at least an hour a week that entire time before we wrote the first word. Mm-hmm. And so that was a process. Before we jumped on this call, I went to count how many drafts we had of the first submissions before it ever got in. And I counted 23 named drafts. Mm-hmm. So where we would put like the version number in the actual title. And there was at least another 20 or 30, maybe even 40 other drafts where it was just, a picture or some notes, or maybe the beginnings of the introduction and things like that. So it took a lot more. I'd say after our first kind of 6 months of brainstorming, I don't know the exact timeline, but at least another year before we actually probably got everything written down and friendly reviewed and in shape where we wanted to submit it to the journal. Just in case you're curious, there was another 30 drafts from the R1 and then another 11 on the R2, and then it was conditionally accepted. So at least 64 named version drafts of the document.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot.
One thing you guys know, one thing you need in this game is patience. You've got to be patient. If you rush it, and you know, we've all been AEs at this journal, and we have all seen submissions that are clearly not well baked. They just are submitted before their time, and you've got to live with the paper for quite a while. I love the idea of just having it on the whiteboard for 6 months and brainstorming before things get written down, because once you start writing things down, then you start falling in love with your own writing, and it becomes harder to change it. Really, that initial time where you're just forming the dough and sticking it in the proofer, that's where you're setting the foundation for the writing.
Perfect. So what would you say were the biggest challenges that you faced on this project overall?
I had thought that one a little previously, so I'll jump in first if that's okay, Don. We've got these 3 lenses, right? And we wrote them kind of independently and then worked to really get them integrated. And so that's like the first 15 pages or so of the paper. And that all really gelled really well. It made a lot of sense. But then of course there's the and then what? And that was the and then what for us was, obviously there's an interrelationship between these 3 lenses. They don't exist independently to, I do this and this and this, and then my utility is the output, right? It was, no, they're related. They've got some kind of dynamic going on, and figuring that out was really, really tough. In the first submission, we had challenged ourselves, but maybe the conclusion was there's a relationship between them, and that's for future research to kind of unpack. And reviewers, this is to their credit, we're like, nope, you got to do that. You got to do that in this paper. And they gave us, wonderful ideas. And Sharon Alvarez was the editor, and she gave us wonderful ideas on how we could do that. And so that was really the whole entirety of the first revision. Was the reviewers were generally okay with the first 15 pages, but they're like, nope, you got to build out those second 15 pages in a much more robust way. And so those were, a whole nother set of brainstorming discussions and whiteboarding and really challenging and critically thinking about. And at that point, Don had suggested a really major change to the paper. And Don, I'll never forget this meeting. Maybe you don't remember it. Don's more senior than I am, and I don't think I had tenure at that time. So someone who could potentially vote on my package, it just made me so he suggested this change. Like, no, we can't do that. There's no way. And I went back to my office. I was storming mad. And then over a couple of weeks, Don completely convinced me that change was what we had to do, and we did, and the paper is much better for it. But it just kind of goes to the dynamics of kind of how you do these things. That was a really hard kind of couple of months figuring out those interrelationships and those dynamics and really challenging ourselves.
So you're saying you were the biggest challenge in this project?
Yeah. My size, Don said, I kind of
That's
fell
what
in love
hearing.
with. I fell in love with what we.
Jonathan's ego was the biggest challenge in the project.
Right, yeah,
But at some point during the review process, I can't remember exactly when, John probably knows better than I do, we realized what an overwhelming influence the worldview was on the other parts of the model. And we hadn't entered the paper with that. I'm pretty sure that wasn't in the first version. So if anybody who's watching this is going to actually pull the paper, and I hope you do, you'll see that at the end we provide a process model where everything kind of fits together, and it just shows the overwhelming influence of the worldview on the other parts of the model. And I think that was sort of struggling with that and figuring out how that actually works. It was hard and then really rewarding. And just kind of a trivial thing we struggled with was, well, should we call this utility or should we call it satisfaction? And we went back and forth in different versions, because utility is economists love the word utility, and it really works. But we actually presented it once, and somebody got mad in the audience because they thought we were trying to be like economists. I don't know exactly what the criticism was, but felt that we should just simply call it stakeholder satisfaction. So we went back and forth on that, ended up with utility.
Yeah, and they do have different implications, because I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about this, or think others think differently, but I tend to think of utility as an input, in the sense that it's an objective function, right? And it's
Yeah.
the basis upon which I'm going to make decisions. Whereas I also tend to think of satisfaction as kind of an outcome.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way of looking at it. I wish I had you around earlier when we could have thought that out better.
Is this an input into the decision-making process, or is this an outcome of the decision-making process?
Yep, that's
right?
good.
That would be, in my mind, the distinction between satisfaction and utility.
Sorry, Rich.
You go ahead.
And the reviewers are super helpful in this regard too, because we got really lucky in the sense that we got great reviewers, and I think AMR does I'm a little biased here, but I think AMR does a great job selecting reviewers and editors.
Just as a reminder to our viewers, Jonathan is another associate editor at AMR, so that's his bias. Yes.
And so and so rather than like telling us we had to do something, they were always framed as just a conversation, right? Hey, has the author team thought about whether or not this is actually utility, or if satisfaction is a better DV for you? And of course, we're behavioral kind of strategists, me and Don and Eunyoung, and so we're drawing on psychology and elements of sociology and things like that. And so satisfaction made a lot of sense just in terms of the other words that we were using and the other theories that we were using. And so really, but to their credit, the reviewers were always willing to just have a conversation with us about this and giving their input, and then we would of course do the response and give our input, and of course the manuscript grew out of that conversation.
You obviously have kinder reviewers than I usually get.
Yeah,
I have to say they weren't in love with us. There's no and they were, in fact, they were pretty critical in the beginning, but they were also quite constructive, and it did feel like they wanted us to succeed, even though they had a lot of criticisms.
Nice. So let me shift gears and ask a completely different question, which is, what impact do you hope that this paper will have in the future? And I guess you could think of this, at least I tend to think of this as 5 possibilities, right? It could have an impact on future theory. It could have an impact on future empirical research. It could have an influence on an impact on future practice, perhaps an impact on future pedagogy, or maybe even an impact on future policy. So there's 5 different dimensions you could go with there. Just pick one and tell us, what impact do you hope this paper will have in that dimension?
I think it's most likely to have an impact on the stakeholder theory conversation. What I hope it has the most impact on, I guess, is practice, because I'm getting farther into my career, the more I really just want to actually be helping, the practical world. And so I think to the extent that we can translate this in our MBA classes, and maybe pedagogy has something to do with it too, but sort of find ways to have this influence the practice. I think that would be a great thing. John?
Yeah, I agree. I keep thinking, I think I mentioned Don and I, we each teach ethics to the various MBAs here. And we've kind of co-developed our courses, so there's a lot of similarities between them. So there's not a lot of variance between the MBA cohorts. And as part of that, we developed this kind of framework for ethical decision making, something we're really proud of, and we're hopeful that our MBAs will obviously get some use out of it, and then maybe we can develop for in the future. But I would say this framework has a similar feel to it, meaning you could turn this into a framework for decision making, or at least for thinking about decisions. For managers and for students. And so, there's 3 dimensions. We talk about the relationships, but there's kind of ways to understand each dimension. And so, as a manager is making a decision that influences stakeholders, which is of course any decision that they're going to make, they could think about these 3 lenses independently, and then they could think about them in concert as they're kind of making that decision. So, in addition to all the, the cost and finance and other elements of the decision that they have to make. And so I would hope, like John, that we might have an impact there. And then, of course, we've had the opportunity to present this paper to a lot of folks in the stakeholder theory space, and really hopeful that they'll pick it up and kind of run with it and add to it like we did, and test it with some brilliant models and kind of go forth.
And just one more word on the teaching of MBA students. Now that I've been doing it for many years, early on, I used to like to have a debate between people who would take the Milton Friedman very narrow shareholder point of view and maybe the Ed Freeman more broad stakeholder point of view, and I would set them up in two parts of the room and I'd let them choose which side they wanted. As the years have gone on, I started having a harder and harder time getting people to join the Milton Friedman group, and I'm finding this shift with my MBA students that they're really joining the Jay Barney idea, which is that it's just kind of important for value, for creating value in the firm to be able to engage, and make happy your full set of stakeholders. And so I think this work really complements that idea. It just helps to flesh out what that means to satisfy your stakeholders, to provide them utility, the kind of utility that's going to keep them engaged, and that's going to allow you to keep running your organization. And so anyway, I think it's a nice fit with all that.
I'm not sure Jay would go along with you on the full set of stakeholders. I mean, I suspect
I understand.
The irreplaceable set of stakeholders.
Exactly, that's right. I shouldn't mischaracterize his point of view. People should read what he's written, which is really important stuff about stakeholder theory.
Yeah. Now, Jonathan, I think I like your answer to the question, because I was thinking a similar direction, right? In the sense that, in some sense, this is not intended to be a complete theory, this paper, right? Because it doesn't get to the actual decision making, as you pointed out, right? So presumably, a future theory could build on this to extend it into decision making, and that's kind of implicit in your use of the word utility in the title, right? Because, as I mentioned earlier, utility is kind of an objective function that is used as an input into a decision making process, usually in the way economists use the term utility. So it would be just, I think, a very natural extension for theorists to think through, okay, now that we understand what goes into the utility function, what decisions come out of that utility function?
And I think, like any AMR or any theory type article, obviously we're very incomplete in the sense of we're just continuing the conversation as opposed to providing a whole lot of answers to that conversation. But you're right. I think, if a manager were to work through our theory and think about it as a framework, what they get is kind of an output where, maybe they're weighing two decisions, and they'd be able to say, this decision will affect these stakeholders in this way, and this is kind of how we expect they might react, and this other one. So rather than, of course, thinking about that dyadic, how will customers react to this, it's kind of thinking a little bit more broadly in terms of how the others might react to this decision. And so hopefully it would just kind of add just another one of those elements to that decision tree.
Great. Well, gentlemen, I am out of questions at this point. So you're welcome to add any additional comments if you think there's important questions that I didn't ask that I should have asked. I'm happy to, entertain your comments on those.
Well, we definitely appreciate the opportunity. It's fun to talk about the paper, fun to sort of go back in time, because, over the years, it takes years to put a paper like this together, and then sort of revisiting how we approached it. It's just fun to think about, fun to talk about it with John.
And I appreciate that this video will help future theorists, young researchers who may never have produced a contribution to theory, to help them think through, the process and how they can contribute to theory as well. So it's a great way of giving back to the profession. Thank you very much for doing it.
Thank you.
I'll add there, that Rich, that as part of when we first started thinking about the actual writing part of the theory, we drew very heavily on Don and Mike Farr's From the Editor essay.
Yes.
that discusses the building blocks of a theory paper and what Don likes to call the 5 C's. So I would encourage folks to go get that. Rich, your own work on contributing to theory, and then Jay Barney has that From the Editor about writing the really short introductions, and
Right.
And Don and I took a stab at that too with Young, and we're able to kind of get that as an exercise to kind of think about how to frame and write the initial parts of the series. So all of those resources that Rich, I know you and we promote regularly
Right.
in AMR workshops and things like that. All 3 of those those resources and others were just really important from the get-go.
Yeah, it's a good time in the history of the field to be a young theorist, because there's a lot of these tools and resources just sitting around as low-hanging fruit to enable young researchers, to help them develop their thinking, help them develop their theoretical contributions. Thanks for mentioning that. Well, great. Thank you again for participating in today's episode of the AMR Origin Series.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks for having us.